Peter Pham is the director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. I asked him where the renewed violence in South Sudan is coming from.
To have an authentic peace deal, you have to have two sides that really want to make peace. And what we have in South Sudan is really a forced shotgun marriage, you could say, between two people who were dragged kicking and screaming to the altar. It took threats by the international community, including the United Nations and individual countries like the United States and others, to force President Salva Kiir and then rebel leader Riek Machar to sign the deal last year. Then it took months more until this April before they actually began implementing the deal, and Riek Machar came back to Juba and was reinstalled as vice president of South Sudan. But it's been a marriage that's been forced and putting fighters from two opposing factions with a lot of bad blood between them together in a closed environment. The rainy season's come, so they're isolated there. This was no surprise. That what was surprising perhaps was the date of the violence, but not that it was inevitably going to happen.
So it was a powder keg. Do these two gentlemen have control over their followers? I mean, you said there's all this bad blood. I mean, both of them have said they don't want the fighting. Of course, that's the pronouncements I guess everyone would make. But do they have control?
That's not quite clear, and I don't necessarily think they do have control. What would have given them control is some resources to pay off their fighters and keep them loyal to some sort of chain of command. But this is a country that's so destitute, they couldn't even afford to celebrate the 5th anniversary of its independence this past weekend. There were no celebrations, not that there's much cause for celebrating. Oil accounts for over 90% of the country's revenue, and production has been killed by the violence, ironically, that these two gentlemen and their followers carried out in the last 2 years. Plus, what oil is being pumped is at a very low price. So government has no money. They've divided up the government ministries, but the ministries have no resources. So they have really nothing with which to purchase the loyalty and the obedience of their followers.
Ban Ki-moon outraged, wants the UN Security Council to impose an arms embargo. Is there more than the international community can do?
Well, an arms embargo would be a good first step. But it's only a first step. The country is awash in arms, more than enough to continue fueling this type of conflict. And remember, the conflict is mercifully contained at the moment, because these are fighters in Juba already. They can't move across the country because of the rainy season. But that's going to end in about 2 months' time. The roads will dry, and you can move large numbers of men and women around, and that's when things will get really dicey.
And when you say really dicey, are we looking at a humanitarian crisis? I mean, how bad can it get?
I think we already have a humanitarian crisis with the millions of people displaced, with the crops that are not being planted, which means a food crisis later on this year, since there will be no crops to be harvested, food insecurity. And then, of course, we have the specter of renewed fighting. Because, again, the will for peace might be there on the part of the international community, but the warring factions themselves have yet to really show that they're committed to peace.
You mentioned this was basically a shotgun marriage. I guess really when it comes down to it, is there any mechanism out there that can bring these two sides together, given the fact that that's how this all started?
Well, ironically, the one common interest both President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar have is that, ironically, neither of them really wants the elections that they're supposed to be working towards. The international community would like elections, but if the people of South Sudan were given a truly free, fair choice, they probably would kick both men who've been the cause of their misery out to the side of the road and pick new leaders. And so these two men have no incentive to really hasten the day of the transition.